Welcome back. Joining me to discuss Tuesday's election results and so much more is Laura Wides Muñoz, a reporter with the Associated Press, and Miami Herald political writer Marc Caputo. So let's get going right now.
Sure.
So Jennifer Carroll, you just saw the interview that we did. Give me your first reactions.
I think there are two things. She's rehabilitating her reputation. She's got a strong story there. Her, upbringing. She was in the military. She learned how to clean jets. So she was away 6 months at a time with 3 small kids. She did it all. So I think that's pretty interesting. I also think coming, from someone who is a Republican, who was very close to the governor and is speaking some of the things that you kind of hear on background, but not officially, is not going to help him in this election.
Mark, does it just come across those sour grapes?
No. One of the reasons Scott chose her as a running mate in 2010 is she's telegenic. She's fantastic on television. You certainly heard a lot of negative male piece language in here. You can bet that the Democrats are at least going to pull some of this interview or some of the things she says from her book and put those in mailers, flyers. Remember, black voters are very important to this race. And in South Florida, where there's a high proportion of black voters, there's also a growing Caribbean American community. And then there's also the issue of women, and Democrats have made the quote-unquote war on women. We'll leave the dispute over the phrase later. She checks all the right boxes for the Democrats to use as an attack on Rick Scott, just as she fit the right boxes or checked the right boxes for Rick Scott to use when he campaigned in 2010.
So do you think this might have an impact in terms of the election?
It might have an impact, but remember, an election is a battle, and you actually have to use the tools that you have, and you have to use them effectively. And one thing we know about the Democratic Party in Florida in midterms, they seldom miss an opportunity, which is why they're so out of power.
But that said, they've also got a woman, again, as a lieutenant governor candidate, and they may be able to connect the two and how in the other race Jennifer was treated. And so looking now toward Annette Taddeo as the Democratic lieutenant governor candidate, there may be that connection people can resonate with.
Speaking of the word connection, that is the takeaway for me. Was I just found it fascinating that the governor has always had this trouble sort of connecting with people. He always comes across kind of distant. But I always just assumed that was part of the standoffness with the press and with that. But it seems like even those around him experience that same thing. That's what I thought was particularly telling. Do we have a sense for just why do we think the governor has such a hard time sort of connecting, Mark?
That's his personality, from what I understand. In 2010, when he ran and we were learning about him, we read quite a bit and interviewed quite a number of people who had said that his time at Columbia HCA was very much like this. He was kind of isolated. And one of the people who worked for him, both in government or has worked in government and worked for him for Columbia HCA, Alan Levine, had told me at one point that he was a nice guy, but he always had really mean people around him at HCA. Well, the same definition, the same phrase came up when he was governor. And she's kind of confirming that.
And I think that it really is a personality thing. I never saw it, when I dealt with him, I never saw it as a thing toward the press. I mean, he may also...
It's toward everyone.
He doesn't like the press, and he doesn't, take any of our questions. We know that. But, it's always been who he is, which is just there are some people who are real people.
And that speaking of people, that's your juxtaposition with Charlie Crist on the other side.
Right.
Who sometimes people view as being all personality and no substance in terms of policy. And so this sets up, and that's what I think is the most interesting part about this race that we're facing is this isn't a race between two people that the state won't know. Everyone is going to know who Rick Scott is. Everyone's going to know who Charlie Crist is. Nobody's going to be going to the poll wondering if Alex Sink is a man or a woman, as they did 4 years ago. This time around, they're going to know who the two candidates are, and the differences are pretty stark.
The question is how many people show up. All indications right now, or many of the indications right now, are that the Democrats, as with other midterms, are not that enthusiastic. And Republicans are very enthusiastic voters. So right now the polls, the money, and the passion seem to be on the side of Governor Rick Scott.
At the same time, I would argue if you go to the Democratic headquarters in Broward and here in Miami, it's a complete Obama machine turned 2014.
Look at the turnout. The turnout was horrible.
Right, you got the turnout, but that group of grassroots coordination, they did not have that with Alex Sink. So it will be very interesting to see whether that can translate from go Obama to go Chris.
Well, you have to also imagine that if I'm Hillary Clinton and Hillary Clinton's people and I'm interested in Hillary Clinton running in 2016, I want to make sure there's a Democrat in the governor's mansion in Tallahassee. Same thing if I'm a Republican, I want Rick Scott in the governor's mansion in Tallahassee. So you're going to see a lot of outside money, a lot of outside big names coming into the state to try to rev it up and make it a national election.
But the people I talked to in the office, in the campaign offices, I said, how long have you been involved with politics? And they said, since 2012. These are new recruits.
I want to just turn to another race because I thought it was particularly interesting talking about partisan elections, the nonpartisan race between Linda Bell, a county commissioner, and Danielle Levine Cava in that race in which Danielle Levine Cava overtook an incumbent. For only the third time in 20 years an incumbent has lost, and she did it largely by trying to make it a partisan race, turning Democrats out, identifying as a Democrat, identifying Linda Bell as a Republican. And I'm just wondering if this is the model that the Democratic Party is going to use across the county going forward.
Oh, yeah, you started to see that under Annette Taddeo, now the lieutenant governor. The Republican Party in Miami-Dade County has got the blues. The Dade Democrats are growing in number and in influence, and you saw that there. Now, there's also the problem that Linda Bell had. I heard Katie Sorensen on the radio today on the Gray Zone radio show, 880 AM. And she said that Linda Bell had grown arrogant and that was a bad thing. And then there were also questions to a degree about her ethics with some sort of fencing business related to her family. You put those things together with the fact that you had a very pumped up, organized Democratic machine.
Labor for the first time, my impression was that Labor rarely will, what usually happens in Dade is Labor will endorse and then leave you alone. Labor in this case endorsed and yet put out a lot of people, boots on the ground in that district, going door to door and getting people to the polls to vote.
And you know what else is interesting? I mean, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, she did come out for Bell, and she's, a long time, very well known, influential Republican down here, and
the person am I wrong? The person who should be most worried by this trend would potentially be Carlos Jimenez. If in 2016, when he's up for re-election, he's an R who doesn't run as an R, but if the Democrats decide to get their act together and target him, it could be interesting in 2016.
Yeah, and I think the elephant in the room here is Rick Scott. Rick Scott appeared with Linda Bell right before the election. Carlos Curbelo, who had Congressional District 26 that extends from Kendall to Key West, he campaigned with Jeb Bush and with Mitt Romney, but not with Rick Scott. And Rick Scott was also used on negative flyers in Homestead. So this is certainly a hostile county when it comes to Governor Rick Scott, even though he chose Lieutenant Governor Lopez Quintero. But
precisely, perhaps why he chose.
I got to say that I do see Jimenez. He is going to be having a fundraiser for Rick Scott, but I do see that being a potentially dicey thing for him if Rick Scott is truly a pejorative here, which right now the data indicate he is.
I want to just turn to Burger King because the home of the Whopper is now suddenly going to be Canadian, eh? But what's interesting is I have not heard the vitriol, at least among the local congressional delegation or the local senators, maybe I've missed it, talking about how this notion of inversion where U.S. companies are sort of becoming foreign companies to avoid paying U.S. taxes.
They are keeping their headquarters in Miami, so if you don't want them to move to another state, you probably don't want to slam them for, making their legal setup in Canada.
I think it's different. I think they all want free Whoppers and they don't want to pass up that opportunity.
Go ahead.
There is something else just interesting about the move to Canada is that, it does also make it easier. One of the issues, we face here is, bringing in foreign workers and having people set up in Canada, coming to Canada, and then you can just more easily transfer them right into the U.S. That is a benefit and a number of companies are doing that. I don't know if that's the case of
And
Burger
for those
King.
who don't know, Tim Hortons is ubiquitous. Tim Hortons is like Starbucks and Dunkin' Donuts combined in Canada. You can't swing a dead badger in Canada without hitting a Tim Hortons somewhere in the Canadian Great North.
Nate Silver's 538 blog, I think they said, they would have to lose 6% of, the U.S. market in sales in order to lose the tax savings that they're getting in Canada.
So that's an advantage they're willing to sort of take. Marc Caputo, Laura Wides Muñoz, I appreciate it. There's going to be a lot this political season. We're about 65 days to the election. There's going to be some good ones down here in South Florida. I want to thank you both for coming in. We'll be right back.